At Sunday dinner, my dad, Richard, casually announced he had updated his will. Everything would go to my sister, Vanessa, since she'd actually done something with her life. My mom, Elaine, nodded. I just grinned, finished my plate, and left. I should have seen it coming, but somehow I was still caught off guard when Richard dropped the bomb over Elaine's famous pot roast. We were having our usual Sunday dinner at their house, the same routine we'd followed for years. Vanessa had driven down from the city with her husband, Mark, and their twin boys, Caleb and Ryan, looking every bit the success story she'd become. Corporate lawyer, six-figure salary, house in the suburbs with a white picket fence. Meanwhile, I sat there in my work clothes, having come straight from the auto shop I'd been running for the past 8 years. Richard was cutting into his roast when he mentioned it so casually, you'd think he was discussing the weather. He'd updated his will recently, he said, and everything would be going to Vanessa since she'd actually done something with her life. Elaine just nodded along like they'd already discussed this privately and come to a mutual agreement. I felt the words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I kept my expression neutral. Vanessa looked uncomfortable, shifting in her seat and suddenly finding her mashed potatoes incredibly interesting. Mark cleared his throat awkwardly. Even the kids seemed to sense the tension and went quiet. I took another bite of pot roast, chewed slowly, and grinned. Not because I was happy, God knows I wasn't, but because something clicked in that moment. All those years of feeling like the disappointment, the black sheep, the son who chose grease under his fingernails over a corner office, suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. I finished my plate without saying a word, stood up, thanked Elaine for dinner, and walked out. Behind me, I could hear Richard calling after me, probably wanting to explain his reasoning or justify his decision. I didn't turn around. The drive home gave me time to think, really think about how I'd spent my 20s working my ass off to build something from nothing. How I'd taken a failing garage and turned it into the most trusted auto repair shop in our small town. How I employed 12 people, including 2 single mothers who couldn't find work anywhere else. How I'd been the one to drive Richard to his doctor appointments when his back was acting up while Vanessa was too busy with depositions and court dates to visit more than once a month. But none of that mattered apparently. In their eyes, I was still the kid who disappointed them by choosing trade school over college, who'd gotten his hands dirty instead of wearing a suit to work. That night, I made a decision. If they wanted to write me off, fine. But I wasn't going to make it easy for them. Update 1. The plan started forming the next morning. I'd been thinking about expanding the business anyway, maybe opening a second location in the next town over. But now I had a different kind of motivation. I called my accountant and my lawyer. Yes, even as blue-collar disappointments have professional advisors and scheduled meetings for later in the week. Then I did something I'd been putting off for months. I finally returned the call from that corporate fleet management company that had been trying to poach me. See, what my family didn't know was that my little grease monkey operation had caught the attention of some major players. 3 different companies had approached me in the past year about either buying me out or bringing me on as a regional manager for their service operations. I turned them all down because I liked being my own boss, and I didn't want to leave the community that had supported me. But circumstances change. The fleet management company was particularly interesting. They handled maintenance for delivery services, rideshare companies, and small business fleets across 3 states. They'd been impressed with my shop's efficiency ratings and customer satisfaction scores. More importantly, they were offering stupid money, the kind of money that would make Vanessa's lawyer's salary look like pocket change. When I met with their regional director that Wednesday, I learned they were looking for someone to oversee their expansion into our area, not just as an employee, but as a partner. They wanted to license my business model and put me in charge of developing a network of certified shops across the region. The initial investment they were offering was more than I'd made in the past 5 years combined. I didn't say yes immediately. I'm not impulsive despite what my family might think. But I told them I was interested and asked for a detailed proposal. Meanwhile, I started making some other calls, to the bank, to my insurance company, to the landlord who owned the building next to mine. If I was going to do this, I wanted to do it right. Update 2. By the following Sunday, I had all the information I needed. The corporate deal was even better than I'd initially thought. Not only were they offering partnership terms that would make me wealthy, but they were also interested in my employees. Anyone who wanted to stay on would get significant raises and benefits packages that included healthcare, retirement plans, and paid vacation. Things I'd always wanted to provide but couldn't afford as a small business owner. This time, I almost skipped Sunday dinner, but I realized I wanted to see my family's faces when they inevitably asked what I'd been up to. So, I showed up, same as always, and sat through the usual routine. Richard was in a good mood, talking about some golf tournament he'd watched on TV. Elaine was fussing over Vanessa's kids. Vanessa was on her phone half the time, probably dealing with some work crisis. Mark made small talk about the weather and local sports teams. Nobody asked me how my week had been. Nobody seemed curious about why I'd left so abruptly the previous Sunday. It was like they'd already written me off so completely that my presence was just background noise. But I noticed things like how Richard complained about his insurance premiums going up. How Elaine mentioned needing to get their roof repaired but wanting to wait until spring to save money. How Vanessa casually mentioned that her firm was considering layoffs due to a major client pulling their contract. After dinner, when we were all sitting in the living room, Richard brought up his will again. He wanted to make sure I understood his reasoning. He said Vanessa had worked hard to build a career and provide for her family. She'd be able to manage the inheritance responsibly and ensure it benefited future generations. I just nodded and told him it made perfect sense. The relief on his face was almost comical. He'd probably been expecting an argument, maybe some tears or pleading. Instead, I congratulated Vanessa on her success and told her I was happy for her. The confusion in the room was palpable. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected from the family disappointment. 3 weeks later, I signed the partnership agreement. The corporate lawyers had expedited everything once they realized I was serious. The signing took place in a conference room downtown with more paperwork than I'd ever seen in my life. The deal was structured in phases. First, they buy out my existing business for a sum that made my accountant's eyes light up like Christmas morning. Then, I transition into my new role as regional development partner with an initial territory covering 5 states. My starting salary was more than double what Vanessa made, with performance bonuses that could easily triple that amount. The best part? They wanted me to maintain the community-focused approach that had made my original shop successful. I wasn't just getting rich. I was getting rich while helping other small business owners expand and improve their operations. I kept quiet about the deal for 2 more weeks while the paperwork finalized and the transition began. My employees were ecstatic when I told them about their new benefits packages. 2 of them actually cried when they learned about the healthcare coverage. One had been rationing insulin because she couldn't afford regular doctor visits, and the other had been putting off surgery for a hernia because of the cost. The local newspaper ran a story about the expansion, calling it a hometown success story and noting how rare it was for national corporations to partner with local businesses rather than simply buying them out. The reporter interviewed several of my longtime customers who talked about how my shop had always gone above and beyond to help people keep their cars running even when money was tight. That's when I decided it was time for another Sunday dinner. Update 4. I arrived at Richard and Elaine's house that Sunday with a copy of the newspaper tucked under my arm. The front page featured a photo of me shaking hands with the corporate executives with the headline, "Local Mechanic Partners with National Fleet Management Company in Multi-Million-Dollar Deal." I placed the paper on the kitchen counter while Elaine was finishing up the cooking, just casually, like I was setting down my keys. She glanced at it, did a double take, and called Richard over. I watched their faces as they read the article, saw the exact moment when the reality of the situation sank in. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later with her family. She spotted the newspaper immediately. It was hard to miss since Elaine had left it spread open on the counter. I watched her read through the article twice. Her expression shifted from confusion to something I couldn't quite identify. Dinner conversation was stilted. Richard kept looking at me like he was seeing a stranger. Elaine asked a few careful questions about the business deal and I answered them honestly but without elaborating. Vanessa was unusually quiet, barely touching her food. Finally, Richard cleared his throat and asked me directly about the partnership. I explained the basics, how I'd be overseeing expansion across multiple states, developing training programs for mechanics, and working with small business owners to improve their operations. I mentioned the salary range casually, like it was no big deal. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark was the first to speak, congratulating me on the success. His enthusiasm seemed genuine, but I caught him glancing at his wife nervously. Vanessa finally managed to say something about being proud of me, but her voice sounded strained. Richard spent the rest of dinner asking questions about the business, suddenly very interested in the details of my work. How had I built such a successful operation? What made my approach different from other shops? Had I always planned to expand like this? I answered his questions politely, but didn't elaborate much. After all, he'd had 32 years to show interest in what I was doing. Why start now? As dinner wound down, Richard brought up his will again. He'd been thinking, he said, maybe he should reconsider the distribution. Perhaps it would be more fair to split things evenly between his children. I looked at him for a long moment, then shook my head. I told him his original decision made perfect sense. Vanessa had worked hard for her success and deserved to be recognized for it. I didn't need their inheritance anymore anyway. The look on his face was something I'll never forget. It was like he was finally seeing me clearly for the first time, but only after it was too late to matter. I finished my plate, thanked Elaine for dinner, and got up to leave. This time, nobody called after me. 6 months later, my new position had me traveling constantly, overseeing the development of partner shops across the region. I was making more money than I'd ever imagined possible, working with incredibly smart people, and helping transform small businesses and communities just like the one I'd grown up in. The work was challenging in ways I'd never experienced: corporate strategy meetings, financial projections, regulatory compliance, all the stuff my family probably assumed I wasn't smart enough to handle. Turns out when you combine street smarts with business acumen and a genuine desire to help people succeed, you can accomplish remarkable things. Richard and Elaine started calling more frequently. Richard would ask about my travels, about the communities I was working in, about the challenges of managing such a large territory. Elaine would mention how proud they were when people around town talked about my success. Vanessa sent occasional texts, usually forwarding articles about the automotive industry or business development strategies. I was polite but distant. I answered their questions, thanked them for their interest, and kept the conversations brief. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires emotional investment, and I'd moved past that. I just didn't see the point in pretending we had the kind of relationship we never actually had. The final irony came 8 months after that first Sunday dinner revelation. Vanessa called me directly, which was unusual enough to get my attention. She'd been laid off from her firm. The budget cuts she'd mentioned had finally materialized, and despite her seniority, she'd been among the casualties. She was struggling to find another position at her salary level. The legal market had shifted, she explained, and firms were hiring younger associates at lower pay rates rather than experienced lawyers with higher expectations. Mark's income was steady, but not enough to cover their mortgage and the kids' private school tuition. She asked if I knew anyone in the corporate world who might be hiring legal counsel. My company, for instance, did we need attorneys? I told her I'd ask around, which I did. But I also mentioned that if she was interested in a change of pace, we were always looking for people with analytical skills to help with business development and compliance issues. The pay wouldn't match her old salary initially, but there was significant growth potential, and the benefits package was excellent. 2 years after the pivotal Sunday dinner, Jake is now a regional VP overseeing 200 shops across 8 states and employing over 3,000 people. His company went public, making him independently wealthy. He lives in the mountains, still enjoys working on cars, and is in a healthy relationship with someone who values him for who he is. Family dynamics have shifted. His parents are proud and now brag about him, while his sister Vanessa, who took a major pay cut after being laid off, remains distant. Despite their earlier rejection, Jake no longer seeks their approval. He reflects on how being underestimated became the fuel for his success. Fixing things, whether cars or his own life, is still part of who he is.